interrupting, and we'll go here. Okay, so welcome those of you who have just joined us. So we are recording this meeting for future use, so all will be on mute except the speakers, and only the current speaker will appear on your screen. Please use the chat feature throughout the presentation should you want to ask a question, share an aha moment, or wish to share a relevant resource, or participate in responding to the questions brought forth in the presentation. Also in the chat will be important links for renewal units and resources, including a link for the Google Drive folder that will have all of the resources mentioned in the webinar. These resources will include a renewal unit attendance sign-in sheet, so please make sure to put your full name in the chat also as roll call. This will be especially important if you would like renewal units for this evening. So right after the webinar, the evaluation survey will be open. If you would like renewal units, please make sure to complete that. If you are not seeking renewal units, still please make sure to complete the feedback survey, because this very webinar series happened because of your feedback. It was the most requested webinar. Should we be doing another webinar in the future? So here we are doing it thanks to your feedback. We really do pay close attention to that, so thank you. But that survey is only open until tomorrow afternoon, so do make sure to complete that survey right away. We are so excited to launch this new webinar series focused on Indian boarding schools. And like I said, the feedback was provided by you, our audience, and we have such an incredible lineup of presenters for you. But tonight's presenter is Jordann Lankford Forster. Jordann also goes by Bright Trail Woman. She is Ani and Anishinaabe. Jordann is an Indian Education for All instructional coach in Great Falls and a lead facilitator for Bright Trail Education, an education consulting company that provides culturally competent education strategies, equity training, and dropout prevention plans that serve American Indian communities. Jordann is a 2022 Teresa Veldkamp Advocacy Award for Excellence in Indian Education recipient, the 2022 Montana History Teacher of the Year. She serves on the Montana Advisory Council on Indian Education as the chairperson, and on the governor's Montana Missing Indigenous Persons Task Force. We are so lucky to have Jordann launch our series for us. Welcome, Jordann.
One more thing that we could add to that list is now I am embarrassed. But thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jordann Lankford Forster. My Ani name is Sikbian Nitha, Bright Trail Woman. I am an instructional coach for IFA in the Great Falls Public School District. So what that means is myself, along with my teaching partner, assists educators in our district with incorporating Indigenous content into their classrooms and their curriculum. And we also co-facilitate our educational company, Bright Trail Education. And so I would like to also thank tonight my partner, my teaching partner, Miranda Murray. She's here with me and she's going to be the slide shower. So we'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you all again for joining us. So this afternoon, we will be discussing the history behind boarding schools and their origins. This topic can be emotional and or triggering for some. I will be moving a little bit slower than usual in order to stay focused and keep my own emotions in check. I wanted to be really intentional with my words tonight and really specific. And so I'm going to be moving, like I said, a little bit slower than normal. And I don't mean it at all in a condescending way. That's a little bit of a selfish purpose for me because I tend to get emotional over this subject matter, but also it can be triggering. And so I just think that that should be spoken about before we get into the topic. I may get a little emotional myself. And so I'm just going to ask for some patience and some grace tonight. I want to sincerely thank the Office of Public Instruction for the invitation to share this information. And I also want to thank the participants who are joining live and who will be watching in the future. This information is not meant to blame, shame, or guilt anyone. It is simply to further our own understanding so that we can also disseminate this information to students in a meaningful way. Keeping in mind that this can be a difficult or triggering subject, I would suggest that participants maybe plan on doing something fun after this, maybe going for a walk or spending time with your family. Also keeping in mind that most of the participants are probably educators like myself and might not have a life outside of school during the school week. So I might just encourage you to maybe journal or reflect on this evening by maybe writing it down, just some way to get it out of your body, because a lot of times these conversations can, our emotions stay stuck in us. They have a way of doing that. And that's really also what we're talking about tonight, is how our emotions and our experiences stay stuck in our body. So I just want to encourage you all to do something or take care of yourselves after this information is shared. And then also feel free to ask questions in the chat. This will be somewhat of an interactive presentation tonight. I'll be asking participants to respond in the chat, but also again, feel free to ask questions whenever they arise. So we'll go ahead and get started. What you are seeing here is the federal policy timeline for American Indian people. Historians have categorized the federal policy for American Indians into what you see listed vertically on the bottom of this slide. So we have colonization period, treaty period, assimilation, reorganization, termination, and self-determination. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on the assimilation period, specifically the boarding school era. The reason that we have changed this vertical list to a horizontal list is because how it reads, it really doesn't tell the story of the impacts and the implications of these federal policy eras. So we've adopted it into a horizontal timeline to tell a more accurate account and how these policies affected each other. And so I'm going to give participants a few moments to observe this timeline and ask you to respond in the chat. Anything you notice about this timeline, does anything stand out to you, or any observations that you might make? So we'll give a couple of moments for participants to respond in the chat. Any observations about this timeline, anything that you notice, anything that stands out to you? So I have a response so far of colonization. Colonization has continued to present. They're overlapping, absolutely. Intertwined. Transition trees still have an effect. Yeah. Great. These are all great responses, and that's normally the responses that we get. And the whole reason, again, why we changed it from this vertical timeline to this horizontal, because the vertical as it reads doesn't really tell the whole story. And so we do get the responses of the overlap, the switching or the flip-flopping. And we're focusing on assimilation, but just because that policy has an end date doesn't mean that it doesn't have lasting effects. And just because most of these have an end date doesn't mean that they don't have a lasting effect. So something that we also added to this timeline is that American Indian people didn't begin with colonization. We always like to recognize time immemorial, and that's as long as the river has flown, the grass has grown, and the sun has shone. American Indian people were surviving and thriving on this continent for thousands of years before colonization. And so we always like to acknowledge that as well. And even though, you know, we have these policies that were put into place and they might have had an end date on them, that doesn't mean that the effects still, we aren't still feeling the effects, but also it doesn't mean that everybody was in compliance. There's a reason today that we celebrate the holiday of Juneteenth. Just because slavery was abolished doesn't mean that all of the states were complying with this mandate, with this order. I also suggest, there was a question in the chat about what is termination. So I would also suggest that if you're interested in maybe just screenshotting this, I know the presentation will be available afterwards, but just to further your knowledge, individually looking at these different federal Indian policies, these federal Indian policy eras, and do a little bit more research on them. Just the short and sweet of it is termination was when the federal government decided they were going to get out of the Indian business. And so they terminated the treaty responsibility with tribes. This map, I would like to, I don't know if this is still a thing, but I know that the Office of Public Instruction printed these maps. They're really great. I use them in my classroom. I know that they're available online, but the second policy period that we looked at on that timeline was the treaty. And that's actually where we're going to start tonight, is the federal policy of treaty making. So this map is a map of the state that we now know as Montana. And the colorful purple, yellow, blue areas are the territories that were originally established by several treaties, treaties being legal agreements between tribal nations and the federal government. Specifically the Fort Laramie Treaty, the Flathead Treaties, Blackfeet Treaties, also known as the Hellgate Treaties. After these treaties were signed, things started changing across what we now know as the United States. More states were being entered into the Union, and there became an increase in desire for more land from non-native individuals. So what I mean by this is that although these legal agreements were initially established and signed between sovereign nations being the tribal nations in the United States, we're going to take a look at, through an activity, how these big colorful areas that were initially established became these smaller red areas that we now know as the reservations. So I'm going to ask you to open another tab, please, and go to YouTube. And on YouTube, you are going to search The Invasion of America. It's a video that is 1 minute and 27 seconds long. And I'm going to ask you to, when you return, also if I can get a buddy, return and say, we're back in the chat, that would be great. But when you return, please just enter in the chat your initial thoughts or your reactions or what stands out. So you're going to open another tab, go to YouTube and search The Invasion of America. It's a 1 minute and 27 second video. I'll give you some time to do that. Sweet. Are back, and I'm seeing overwhelming. How quickly it happened. Yeah, and oh, I don't have the YouTube link. Oh, okay. Thank you, Joan. Started east and moved west. Great. So really, I think that this short video is a great visual for telling this story, of how this land was acquired and how quickly this happened, and also this desire for acquisition of land was so immediate. And so it's really based on the values or importance that the federal government and non-native people were putting on resources. So if you watch, it does go East Coast and towards the west with the expansion of farming. But if you'll notice, during the gold rush, California goes like that. The state that we now know as California is acquired like that. And then you see it come from the south to the north, and the desired resource and what was being placed on a high level of importance as far as resources was like cattle runs, but also timber. Smaller mines started happening or being created. So I'm going to ask that we do the same thing one more time. I want you to rewatch, and then we'll discuss anything else that you might notice. So please open another tab. Thank you, Brianna, for putting that in the link. Head to YouTube, watch The Invasion of America, and we will come back together, whole group, and discuss it a little bit further. Right, so the reservation in Oklahoma completely disappeared. So Oklahoma was initially established as what they deemed as Indian territory. Yeah. How much smaller reservations got the sudden disappearance of some previously established reservations. Yeah, and we can follow these rapid changes again with that desire of what we considered important resources. So essentially, or initially these treaties were signed without that understanding, without the ability to know what the United States was going to want or perceive as important in the future. So we started out with that map of Montana, those big colorful areas, and then they were quickly consolidated to much smaller reservations. And these reservations were, at the time of establishment, the permanent areas for American Indian people. It was the area of consolidation. Yep. So we can just see that visually again on this map. I highly recommend this map. It's wonderful for classroom use. Also very confusing, perplexing, frustrating for the sovereign nations who signed these initial legal agreements with the federal government, with the understanding that this was our established territory, right? Most of these treaties initially that were signed, creating these big colorful areas, were the treaties that were allowing safe passage for non-native people to travel to the West Coast once the gold rush started. And then again, we see that desire for new resources created what we now know as the 7 reservations of Montana. I have another question that I would please ask you to respond in the chat with. How do you control a population? How do you control a population? Policies and laws. Fear. Take away their food. Food, water, sustainability. Take away culture. Sorry, I'm not ignoring or trying to skip. Folks are rapidly entering answers, and so the chat line keeps moving. So a lot of limitations I'm seeing. All great answers. For our purposes tonight, these are the 3 issues we're going to focus on. So we have, in the case of American Indian people, we have the boundaries, controlling a group's boundaries. In this case, those what we now know as reservations, those permanent tracts of land. 2, self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency and access to resources are a little bit interchangeable, but self-sufficiency, your ability to take care of yourself, specifically food, hunting, or making your own items from the land that you can no longer travel freely around on, right? Reservation specific tracts of land. And then access to resources. So what I mean by that is similar to self-sufficiency, but specifically how you make your money, what you do for a job. Everyone was being pushed into commercial farming because that was the desired resource, or the desired, I guess, the desired livelihood of what we considered important as the United States. We're going to start with the Dawes Act when we have this conversation. I just want to say that it might be confusing that like this was about boarding schools. I'm getting to that. I think that this part of the story is really what sets up the historical context for the establishment of these schools. So when we look at this Dawes Act, also known as the General Allotment Act, even after reservations were established, so those red areas, even after they were established, there were still efforts for land grabs. And so what I mean by that is what the Bureau of Indian Affairs started noticing, what those officials started noticing was that American Indian people were beginning to farm, but they were communally farming. They were doing so together. And that's not part of the desired American dream. That's not our focus. That's not what our livelihood is. Our livelihood should be private property ownership and private monies, right? And so the General Allotment Act, what it did was it surveyed the land on reservations and it designated 160 acres to each head of household. So if we look at those, let's consider the gray areas. I know that reservations are not perfectly square like this. I just wanted to create a visual that would tell the story a little bit better. So if we look at those gray areas, let's say that was designated to a American Indian head of household, right? Well, then, conveniently enough, the federal government determined that there was surplus land even on reservations. So those 160 acres, let's say the gold areas, were sold off to non-native farmers in the area. So you do not have to be native to live on a reservation or to operate land on a reservation. This was just another way that was meant to absorb. Also, I feel like through assimilation, absorb this minority culture into what now was the majority culture. So when we think of head of household, that doesn't necessarily mean male, but oftentimes it was. So you take a head of household featured up there at the top. By the way, there's no sad faces available on clip art. There was only happy ones. And so I don't mean to be condescending and I don't mean to be rude or unempathetic when I have smiley faces there. That was what was available to me. So if you take one of these and consider them a head of household, one of these folks at the top, 160 acres designated for a head of household, maybe enough for one person, but what happens if they get married? And then you see that they have children. And after a few generations, a family of 11 is trying to share or live off of 160 acres. The government began enticing American Indian people and families to sell more of their land once it became clear that 160 acres wasn't sustainable for an entire family. So they enticed them to sell, pressured them to sell to non-native entities. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had federal agents on each reservation in charge of monitoring the populations. And they started noticing the daily goings on, and they noticed something. There was compliance with the farming, however, assimilation was not working as quickly as they wished. The people were still speaking their languages and not demonstrating other examples of what they deemed appropriate for American culture. So while policies like the Dawes Act were meant to assimilate the adult generations that we see up top of the screen, the federal government began implementing a policy to assimilate American Indians at an earlier age. Boarding schools would be a way to systematically introduce Western customs and practices during formative years in the hopes that the continuation of culture would end. This is a picture of the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. Mission efforts in the establishment of churches and day schools had already begun in the early 1800s as a means of establishing relationships and converting American Indians. So a lot of the groundwork had already been laid. Those missions would slowly turn into day schools themselves. And this picture on the screen is the most infamous boarding school, the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania, proposed by Captain Richard Henry Pratt and approved by Congress in 1879. This was the pilot boarding school meant to demonstrate how well this component worked to achieve total assimilation. Pratt's motto was, "Kill the Indian, spare the man." These were his words, but what is the message? Kill the Indian, spare the man. What is the message behind that? Please respond in the chat. Kill the Indian, spare the man. Take away their heritage. Thank you, Pam. Eradicate the native. Indians were somehow less. Assimilate all American Indians. Brainwash. Brainwash culture out. Absolutely. So this idea of like saving the soul or saving the body while getting rid of the American Indian components. Those are all great answers. Thank you so much for participating in the chat. So this is a slide of a group of Apache students who arrived at the Carlisle boarding school. Children were sometimes sent voluntarily under the premise of learning English, but for the vast majority, they were removed from their homes involuntarily. Oftentimes before photos, like what you're seeing on the screen, were taken upon arrival, but not always. Before photos were very strategic. So knowing that this picture was taken to demonstrate the improvement, to demonstrate how they had been effectively transformed. So when I say strategic, for example, I mean, I have a really hard time personally believing the children featured in the front would arrive to the school without wearing shoes. They're so disheveled, so uncivilized that they arrived to this school not wearing shoes. And I personally have a hard time believing that that is true. So that's what I mean by a lot of times these pictures were very strategic and very staged. These pictures were taken to also romanticize the idea of turning something that was considered uncivilized to civilized. Upon arrival, aspects of their culture, identity, and personal autonomy were stripped away from these children. The standard practice included cutting their hair. There's been reports of washing the remaining hair that was perceived as dirty with kerosene to kill the perceived or assumed lice in their hair. Assigning students with an English name and issuing each student military style uniforms. So this is the same group of students 6 months after their arrival to the Carlisle boarding school. This is their after picture. Under this military model, students were subjected to extreme institutionalized schedule, comparable to what we now know as military basic training. So early mornings, late nights, very harsh work regiments. These schools were English only schools. Language of origin was not permitted. As far as education, these students primarily received labor or industry type of training. Again, harsh punishment was a standard if the rules were broken or if an infraction occurred. Children were secondarily subjected to the threat of death also by disease. When we think of boarding schools and this consolidation where no one left, disease was spread very easily. We also have living testimonies of abuse, whether it be verbal, physical, or sexual, and also withholding of food and other necessities if infractions occurred. Also, I think it's important to, oh, we have something, Jennifer, it always strikes me how severe the after expressions are. It's heartbreaking. I also just want to take a moment to reflect on how traumatic, how difficult, how discombobulated it would feel to arrive to a place where you didn't understand what was happening to you and no one could really explain it to you because they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't explain it to each other. How do you follow rules that you can't understand? This is also a very famous before and after photo of Tom Torolino. So his before picture taken strategically in 1882, and then his after when he exited the Carlisle boarding school. This student was a Navajo student identified as Tom Torolino. And this is an example of the campaign Captain Pratt developed to demonstrate how well the boarding school system was working to spread this model far and wide throughout the United States. What Pratt considered as a demonstration, we would consider propaganda. Please respond in the chat with any observations you make between these two photos. Why might we consider this propaganda? Feel identity. The children didn't always know if they would see their families once they were taken to boarding schools, and likewise the families didn't know if they would ever see their children again. So getting some responses in the chat of observations of these two photos. So it looks posed. I agree. I agree, Valerie. I think that his before photo, his skin is lighter. So the second photo is overly exposed. So that means that Photoshop was Photoshop before we knew it as Photoshop. The second picture is overly exposed to send the subliminal message that these children were physically getting whiter. The idea that this school was so effective in absorbing this minority population into a Western society, that the children were morphing into almost unrecognizable versions of themselves, is pretty absurd, but also shows the desperation for these assimilation efforts. And this can also be seen in the before-after photos that we viewed of those of the Apache children. In their before and after, their skin gets lighter. I think it's also important to mention too that I personally, in all of my research and all of my studies, I've never seen a photo from a boarding school in color. I've only seen black and white style photos from boarding schools. And when I teach educators and students about these schools, we talk about this. Our frame of reference to boarding schools are these very staged examples of propaganda where students, athletes, or other extracurricular groups are viewed as adapting well. These photos were used in reports to the federal government as a means of success. You want to demonstrate how well this is working, how well the students are acclimating to this environment. But besides being staged, after propaganda like this was spread, more and more schools began to open, right? Pratt did his job. He demonstrated, or he tried to prove how well this was working. And so more and more schools across the country began to open, and there was no need to really document anymore, right? Once the pilot worked, it really took off. And so this can be misleading with all of these photos being in black and white for students, especially because their frame of reference is that photos or events that are featured in black and white means it means that it happened a really long time ago. And in actuality, these schools were open in the United States throughout the 1970s, right? There just wasn't a need to document them anymore because it spread, the idea spread, it took off, and they became federally funded all throughout the United States. After the boarding school era ended, it's been calculated that there has been over 400 of these schools that operated in 37 different states across the United States of America. Something that's also important to remember is the living testimony that we still have concerning these boarding schools. So we definitely still have people alive that were forcibly removed from their home and sent to these schools against their wills and their families' will. Just even in my class, I have several students who live with their grandparents who are boarding school survivors. And so when we think back to that federal Indian policy map that I had and how we've added those arrows at the end, meaning this continuation, I still see the effects of these boarding schools in my classroom every single day. And it's not that the kids that I have had to go to these schools, but I see it in their trauma. I see it in their ACEs. I would like at this time to feature a film called Our Spirits Don't Speak English. After this presentation, you will also be sent a resource list in your resource folder, and these are one of those resources. What I like about Our Spirits Don't Speak English is because it features American Indian boarding school survivors, but they're in color. And I think that tells a really important part of the story, is that although we're overly exposed to these black and white images, boarding schools didn't happen that long ago, right? We just didn't document it in the way that we did when they were initially presented. Coercion was also a very common tactic to assure compliance. So this could range from withholding food or supplies in reservation communities or other tactics. This is a group of men known as the Hopi 19. I didn't learn about the Hopi 19 until I was lucky enough to visit Alcatraz Federal Prison in the spring. I'd never heard of the Hopi 19 before, but they're featured in the American Indian display. They have a separate building that they do a display of the American Indian movement and the occupation of Alcatraz. And I had never heard of these men before, but these men did something that was considered a federal crime. These men refused to send their children to boarding school. Their children were ordered to attend a school called Keams Canyon Boarding School in Arizona. And these men were considered traditionalists, and they refused to send their children. So they were sentenced to Alcatraz Federal Prison. When they were sent to Alcatraz Federal Prison, they were sent there for 2 years, but they weren't allowed any communication with their families. So their families didn't even know where they went. Their families had no idea that they were sentenced to this federal prison. So they stayed on Alcatraz for 2 years under the premise. So this is how it was reported. They were charged with sedition. And I'd never heard of sedition either. So I did a little research on that. And sedition charges are conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority. So the federal government took this as a rebellion, their refusal to send their children to these boarding schools. And that's what sent them to Alcatraz. Upon arriving to San Francisco, before they boarded the boat to take them to Alcatraz Federal Prison, the San Francisco Chronicle reported this in 1895. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that 19 murderous looking Apache Indians imprisoned at Alcatraz because they would not let their children go to school. So this was very much framed as a resistance or an unwilling to assimilate, and also just not loving their children enough to want this wonderful opportunity for them, right? They refused to send them to school. They refused to allow them to get an education. And this is an example too of a longstanding narrative that nations like the Apache, Comanche, Pawnee, and Sioux were hostile and wild. We hear that a lot, especially like in Westerns. Those tribes always seem to be like the enemy tribes or the hostiles, the violent tribes. But really, where this narrative originated from was these were some of the tribes that really began resisting assimilation efforts. And I think it's important to remember that anytime someone is perceived as an adversary, that also means that they're fighting for something too. They're fighting to protect something as well. And before I started this, so I went to Alcatraz I learned the things. I came back, and before I started my lesson on Alcatraz with my own students and talking about the American Indian movement, I asked the students what types. I showed them the picture that I featured. I showed them the picture of the Hopi 19, and I asked my students what types of things people would be willing to risk to go to prison. What makes it worth an individual that you'd be willing to go to prison or risk a prison sentence? And most of the guesses were things like war crimes or something having to do with some sort of combat. And then I shared with my students the same as I shared with you this evening, is that what sent them to federal prison was that they refused to send their children to this boarding school in Arizona. Okay. Another response that I'm asking for in the chat is this topic of generational trauma. So please respond in the chat. How generational trauma, how is this harmful to both children, parents, and extended family members? When we think of generational trauma, how is this harmful to not only who it's happening to, but the entire family unit? The really great responses. Thank you for your participation. I saw really quickly, then I didn't get to read the whole thing, but the normal bonds between parent and child. Absolutely. It's very common and understandable that when we begin to look at the boarding school experience, the primary focus, understandably, is on the children and the things that the children physically experienced at these places. But I want to go back for just a second and take a look at this picture, these murderous looking Apache people. And I want to give some time and some space to the ripple effect that is felt among families. There was a question earlier that asked, you know, did the children ever know if they were going to see their families again? And they didn't. But likewise, these parents, these uncles, these grandfathers featured in this photo, they didn't know if they would ever see their children again. A lot of what we learn through experience on a journey to becoming a parent, so we learn how to be a parent a lot of times from our parents or from our extended family members. So when we talk about generational trauma and we look at the patterns of generational trauma, we have what I would consider a gap. It's not that American Indian people can't be parents or are awful parents. That's certainly not true. But we can see a gap of this inherent sense of being and way of becoming a family unit once those generations are removed from the home. So for example, my director here in Great Falls Public Schools, he tells the story of his mother was sent to boarding school, and he has a lot of siblings, and his younger sibling did something that they weren't supposed to do. And so my director was there, but his mother was there, who was sent to boarding school. And then she was talking with her friend, and they were talking about this thing that Dugan's younger sibling did. And the friend of his mother said, well, why don't you ground her? And my director's mother said back, what is grounding? Because of her boarding school experience, she missed this piece of learning through experience of parenting styles, right? There was this gap. And a very unfortunate piece about that is it's certainly not all about punishment. She didn't learn what grounding was, but she also never learned to say, I love you. That wasn't something that was said to her at this place that she was sent to, right? Just this inherent way of being once you live and experience a family unit. When we create these gaps don't just pick up where they left off. These gaps have a radio wave. They have a way of transferring or transmitting and continuing on. So we are going to look at another resource, and that is a book that I cannot recommend enough. So we are going to look at a couple of quotes from this book named Legacy. Suzanne Methot is an Indigenous author from Canada. This book is also featured in the resource list, and I love that. I just can't speak highly enough about this book, but I might be thinking, like, why are we looking at a book from Indigenous author from Canada? The country of Canada had very similar policies and ways of responding to their Indigenous population. So boarding schools were set up very similarly in Canada, just as they were in the United States. So that's what we are going to, that's why we're looking at it, but that's what we're going to take a look at here in a second. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments. In her book, Suzanne Methot says that trauma can be transferred by 4 means. So I'm going to give you several moments actually to read through this and then just make any responses or connections or reactions that you have to this information in the chat. So a couple of more moments. The author states that trauma can be transferred by 4 means. We have a response. Bloody memory is standing out. You still see this trauma played out, absolutely. So we have the psychodynamic process, and that's the process of anger, fear, and repressed grief that parents can sometimes project onto their children. The sociocultural process, the younger generation is socialized by an older generation to believe things about themselves and the world around them from their parents' parenting style. The family system. Children are caught up in emotional issues of their parents, focus on their parents' needs, and result in child's development as an individual not developing in the way that it should. And then the biological process, sociological and genetic means by which trauma is transmitted by blood memory or transplanting trauma. Some good responses in the chat. Yeah, this is a really good, I think this is a good visual. This gives me a better understanding of my own family. I've been to, thank you for sharing that personal information. Biological process is wicked. But yep, certainly. So we look at the psychodynamic, this anger, fear, repression, grief that parents are projecting onto their children. So I think of, being traumatized or wounded, and also not having the language to identify. Sometimes what happened to you can lead to repression and just an inherent sense of anger that you project on to children of your own. The sociocultural process, so then the younger generation being socialized by the older generation to believe things about themselves. Remember, these students, these generations of children were being sent to a place where every day they were told that essentially everything about them was wrong. Everything about them in terms of how they looked, in terms of how they spoke, in terms of how they were raised, in terms of how they interacted with the world around them was wrong. And it wasn't just them. Everything about their family was wrong too. Upon entering these schools, they were given different names. They were given English names. We have also the transfer of the family system. So children are caught up in the emotional issues of their parents. So definitely there can be a regression or a stunting of growth when we experience trauma. So not an evolutionary developmental way where you would wish to progress into adulthood necessarily. We have stunted individuals who haven't been able to progress, and therefore their children or younger family members are seemingly taking care of them or having to take care of them. And then the biological process, the blood memory or the transplanting of trauma, absolutely. So we have makes sense that parents would be impacted by intense interference in family systems and cultures. And then confused, powerless, right? And yep, these are all great responses. Thank you so much for participating. I apologize for going back and reading the chat. If a participant watches this in the future and I'm just sitting here nodding my head and saying, yep, great responses, they can't see that, they won't be able to see the chat, so it's not going to make sense for them. So I try to jump back and forth and read the chat every once in a while. Okay, so continuing our conversation and looking at information also shared in Legacy is this quote. I'm going to give you a couple of moments to sit with this quote and respond with any connections, but I'll read it out loud. Pre-contact, morals and values have been replaced with attitudes and beliefs that negatively affect future generations, such as poor self-concept or negative beliefs about self, internalized shame and hatred, passive compliance, and learned helplessness. These negative inheritances are part of a process that results in a circular reliving of trauma, of genocide and colonialism, generation after generation. Give you a couple of moments to sit with that, and then please respond in the chat. Any connections or aha moments or responses you have to this quote from the book. Thank you, Stacy, for sharing those resources. So we have repairing and acknowledging every culture heritage is vital for student success. So you might be envisioning someone you know, or maybe current students in this quote. I think it's also important to remember that similar to a vast majority of non-Native people, not all American Indian people are familiarized or given access to information surrounding the boarding school experience. Either these topics or educational pieces haven't been provided to American Indian students. Personally, myself, I did not learn about boarding schools until I went to college. I had never heard about boarding schools before. And I think there's what I think about when I look at this quote is I think about I can only speak from my own experience, kind of, you know, like growing up and just thinking like, well, this is the way it is. This is just the way it is. Seeing some forms of dysfunction and saying, this is just how life goes. This is how we are, and internalizing that without ever having access to this information, this type of information. And I also, I don't believe that this should be information that students have to pay for. So like I said, I didn't have access to information around boarding schools. I never even heard the phrase boarding schools until I went to college. And so much of my life and my family experience began to make sense, not necessarily tied to the boarding school piece, but this understanding of intergenerational trauma and patterns. This shouldn't be information that our students have to pay for, right? This should be information that is provided to them, that they have access to. The book that we use in Great Falls Public Schools for the US history curriculum, it's titled The Americans. It does not use the phrase boarding school once. And I have a real problem with that. Not that we need to drill in trauma-related experiences and get into the details of it, but you know, if you're a student native or non-native, that has never heard of a boarding school before, that's going to change the way that you perceive the world. It's going to change your educational experience. And I also don't understand, as educators, I've never been in the business of not telling or sharing with my students accurate history. And this introduction and this concept of boarding schools really makes a difference for students and their educational experience. All right. So after the civil rights movement and the rise of the American Indian movement, these federally ran schools began to close. So we see that in the self-determination era as we move through that, they begin to close. There's still BIE schools, which stands for Bureau of Indian Education, and they're federally funded, but they operate under tribal consultation. Like, tribal communities have a say in how they are ran and how they're operated, so they're a little bit different. I think it's also important to, when we think of how similar Canada ran their federal policies for American Indian people, I was very shocked while I was reading Legacy, to learn that Canadian boarding schools, the last one that was operated in this way, did not close until 1996. The author shares that in the book. I was able to speak to the author of Legacy actually last week, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with the events that recently took place in Saskatchewan, but I believe there were brothers, two Indigenous men stabbed people, and I believe 10 people in total died. And this is certainly not an excuse, but it definitely sheds some light on the situation. The author of Legacy shared with me that those two individuals that did that in Saskatchewan, their parents were survivors of these boarding schools up in Canada. One other piece of information before we go and look at a couple of websites that I would like to share is, we do some work with some BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools down in the state of Wyoming, and they're still located where they've always historically been located since they began operating. And it's crazy. So driving to one of the BIE schools, there's a cemetery outside of it, and this cemetery was created, it was built next to the establishment of, at that time, the boarding school, and the cemetery was for the children who attended this boarding school down in Wyoming, and it's still there. So the original building is still there. Obviously, it's been redone and remodeled, but still to this day, every single day that these students who attend the school ride the bus, they have to pass this cemetery, the cemetery that was created to house the bodies originally of students who did not survive this boarding school experience. All right. So we're going to we'll come back to our contact information, but we're going to end share. And I wanted to just take you to a couple of websites that are also available in your resource folder. So the first place we're going to go is to the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is where I get a lot of my visuals from, specifically related to boarding schools. And the cool thing about the Library of Congress is they actually have boarding school curriculum that they've created as well. So yep, so classroom material, Native American boarding schools. This is a great resource when incorporating primary source documents. into your classroom. I think that I get a lot of questions about like, well, how do you introduce this concept to students? And I definitely think that there's a way to present facts and documents and allow the students to make these determinations of themselves. But I also think that there's like a dateline way to do it. And I think as a society, we get stuck on the dateline thing. Don't get me wrong. I love Lester Holt and Keith Morrison as much as the next girl. But I think as a society, we've really gotten into like the nitty gritty, like details, like the murder and the trauma and the blood and the gore. And I definitely believe that there is a way to incorporate and introduce the concepts of boarding schools into your classrooms where it's not in necessarily a triggering way, right? We've gone through a lot of information tonight. Some of us can probably feel it sitting in our bodies. I can certainly feel it sitting in my body. And there's definitely a way to just incorporate these facts of these boarding schools with our students. This is a great way to do it. So you have primary source documents, you have accompanying photos, and then also there's sidebar click tabs for, here's the teacher's guide, and also potential classroom lessons that you can begin using for your students. Another website that we will take you to very briefly is called Native Knowledge 360. This is developed by the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian, and there's tabs, different lessons, and definitely some digitized information as well on boarding schools if you're looking for resources or ways to incorporate this into your classroom. We have about 15-ish minutes. I'm going to pause for just a second and ask if there's any questions. So I have a question in the chat. What is the way that I think is best to support healing from generational trauma? I truly believe that the first step is understanding generational trauma. Things happen to these students, to American Indian people that there wasn't words for, right? So once we identify generational trauma and understand things like how it's passed along, then we can better understand ways to prevent it, like prevent these cycles from continuing. The other website I just want to share really fast too is, of course, the Office of Public Instruction's website. So if you go to the Indian Education Department and you go to some featured resources, you will find these tabs specific to your subject matter. And there's definitely some boarding school materials also that are found in here. I know one of the featured resources in the OPI curriculum is this Playing for the World. I use this with my students as well. It features the 1904 Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School girls basketball team who became world champions. There is, I believe, also a study guide in here as well, and teacher resources in that way. I will say one thing about this, and this is a conversation that I have during my film study, is I think that this film is a great representation of strong Indigenous females But I also see it kind of as those, the propaganda, those photos that we looked at, right? The before and after photos. This team of female basketball players were able to tour the world, but I also personally believe that part of that tour was also this subliminal message of how well assimilation was working. But I do recommend it. I think it's a great documentary. Fort Shaw is located right outside of Great Falls, and it was the primary boarding school for the state of Montana. Sorry. When I'm talking about boarding schools with my third grade, I get asked, why did this happen? What is an appropriate response to the reasoning of this age? The purpose was assimilation. The federal government wanted American Indian people to be absorbed into their culture. I think too, especially with elementary school students, they have a very justified sense of right and wrong. And so it's not necessarily that you yourself are saying, isn't that awful? Isn't that unfair? Those are things that happen on the playground, right? I think that you can very much introduce these topics, again, not getting into the necessarily gory details, but really presenting these facts to these students and having them determine, using their critical thinking skills, how this was not okay. It looks like there was a question. Yep, Fort Shaw boarding school was the dominant boarding school in Montana. I think it's also important to mention too that strategically, just because you are from that state certainly does not mean that you would be sent to the boarding school that was in your state. It's important to remember that it is very hard to escape, run away from, and get back home if the boarding school you were sent to is located nearby you. So we had students that were sent all throughout the United States. So starting with this boarding school in Pennsylvania, I have 2 students in my classroom whose grandparents met at a boarding school in Utah. They were strategically sent to a boarding school in Utah because it is very hard to run away from a boarding school in Utah back to Montana. All right. Is there any other questions? Oh, I'll pull up my contact sheet too. Sometimes we don't think of the questions. If you're anything like me, I think of what I should have said 5 hours from now. So I'm sure at 2 a.m. I'm going to be thinking, dang it, I forgot to tell them that. Dang, I forgot to tell them that. If you are like me and you think you might have a question later on, this is Bright Trail Education's contact. Please feel free to email or visit our website. But if you have a burning question or you're just looking for a little bit more information or resources, please feel free at any time to reach out and email us. Oh, thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that. All right. I just want to, before Jennifer gets on here, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much to the Office of Public Instruction for this opportunity. Thank you so much for the participants. And again, I just want to reiterate, try to go do something that's for you, a little bit of self-care. We need to get this out of our body. And that's really the premise of what we're talking about tonight, is how this trauma lives in our body. And just personally for me, even just talking about it, like I can feel it here. I can feel it in my tummy. So let's all promise each other that we're gonna go do something for ourselves after this. Thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. I know this isn't the easiest topic, but I would like to remind all of you that we will be having 2 upcoming sessions as part of this series that are focused on more on intergenerational trauma. One will be with Carrie Gopher, who is our Director of American Indian Student Achievement here at OPI. And then we also have Selena Coburn presenting, and she happens to be the daughter of Dugan Coburn, who is the director at Great Falls for the Indian Education and Indigenous Studies programs there. So very, very excited about the quality of the content that we're presenting throughout this series. Next Wednesday, we will be visiting with Kevin Kicking Woman. He is an amazing storyteller. So Jordann, you really brought up so many things that we'll be covering in the webinar series and kind of introduced it in such a great way. So we will be hearing first person narratives from survivors. We'll be hearing some other stories, and Julie Kajun is one of our presenters. She'll be talking about, you know, how to integrate this into curriculum. And so I'm really, really excited about the whole series. So I hope that you can stick with us. Other really exciting things coming up well, I'll be talking about this more towards the end of the series. However, since we have Jordann on right now, she is one of our facilitators for an upcoming hub course, Building Your Indian Education for All Mindset, culturally relevant pedagogy for all, culturally relevant teaching strategies for all. So that course is in process of being created. We're really excited about that. This session has been recorded, so it will be up on the website. In fact, I can